Hey guys, welcome back. Deanna here, owner of Needles in the Hay, and this is video 2 of our Lean into Linen knit along. So I hope everybody's picked their project. They're getting ready to cast on for their swatch. I'm going to give you all the tips and tricks now that you need to be successful with your project. So the key to working with linen, this is the key. Forget everything you know about knitting with wool. Everything you think you know about knitting, throw it out the window, because linen is an entirely different animal and it needs to be approached completely differently. So because linen is so inelastic, and that doesn't make it bad, just makes it different, pure linen yarn won't adjust to your needles like wool will. So here's what I recommend you do to adjust to this. In many cases, and this is especially true if you're knitting a pattern that was designed for animal fibers, you're going to have to go down a couple of needle sizes to compare to what you would use for wool yarn and knit loosely. So if you're knitting a pattern that's already been designed with linen yarns, this is more than likely already been taken into account with the needle recommendation. The stitches of linen are just naturally wider than wool. And that is because the yarn is so stiff when you're knitting with it. And the smaller needles will take care of this. And that can vary from knitter to knitter as well. So for example, for me and my project with Bolin, I am using a 4mm needle and I'm getting a 20 stitches every 4 inches gauge on that needle after blocking. And in a lot of cases, you'll see patterns that will look kind of weird. Like you'll be like, what is up with this gauge of this pattern? You know, it's saying that I'm going to use a fingering weight yarn to get like what I would usually say, you know, is a worsted weight gauge, which is around 20 stitches. But I'm also supposed to use a 3.5mm needle, you know? So it's like, huh? Like most people just don't understand why that is. And that is just because of the properties of linen. So you're knitting wider stitches using a smaller needle, and then it's going to change a lot when you get into the blocking. So again, just like gauge with anything, it varies from knitter to knitter too. If you're already a loose knitter, you may find that linen is great. You know, whatever the recommended needle is what you're going to use. If you're a tight knitter, it might be a different story. So you're just going to have to experiment. And like with wool, the more you work with linen, the more comfortable you're going to be sort of determining where your tension falls into the picture. So depending on the pattern and yarn, you may also need to go up. So just adjust using the size of the needle rather than trying to adjust your personal tension. So don't change the way that you're knitting. Don't try to knit tight to compensate for it. Just use the needle size rather than how you're actually knitting. And it's going to be really hard on your hands to try to knit something tight in linen because it is so inelastic. You're going to be very uncomfortable. So I really recommend that you adjust that needle size instead of trying to adjust the way that you're knitting. So needle material. Even if you are a die-hard metal needle fan, try using bamboo needles. Linen is slippery, and these needles have a bit of texture, which makes the yarn easier to knit and the stitches a bit more even. So I've been using our Kinky Amabari Shirataki needles, and they've been working really well. I'll put a link in the description for you. I love these needles because they are bamboo, but they're also quite slick. For bamboo, they have a nice finish on them, but they give you just enough grip and texture to make working with the linen a little bit easier, and they have sort of the right pointiness of the tip. So the tip is, it's nice and tapered, but also still just a little blunt on the end. So you're not going to be splitting your stitches. So lastly, if you're a perfectionist like me, let it go. Let it go. Your stitches are not going to look perfect. Knit loosely and relaxed. And don't fret if your stitches look kind of uneven. They just are. Because the stitches are wider, they're not going to look quite right to your eye. Everything's going to look way different after you wash and dry. And your garment, when you're knitting it, is just going to feel really wide and squat, and that's okay. That's just how linen is, and it's going to change after you wash. Okay, so some other tips for you. Because linen is inelastic, your gauge could go wandering around a bit. And this is one reason why it's important to choose a pattern with loose gauge and positive ease to accommodate this. It will come out in the wash. So in video 1, I mentioned that choosing the right project meant something with positive ease, something that's going to flow away from the body. And this helps not only because linen has amazing drape, but also because it helps you even out those little gauge in the idiosyncrasies as well. So it just makes gauge slightly less important to the final outcome of the project. When you're weaving in ends, duplicate stitch is a great technique for weaving in ends. So where you copy the look of the stitch on the wrong side. For joining a new ball. So the joins you may like to do with wool, like spit splicing, possibly the Russian join, any join that uses the natural properties of wool to make it work, those are not going to work with linen. So for linen, probably the best two ways that I've seen are to knit the two ends together for a few stitches for a nice sturdy hold. And that then you can just duplicate stitch the tails in both directions. And another option that you can try using is the braided join, which is where you braid the two different ends together. And I'll provide you a link to a tutorial for that in the descriptions. And just don't worry about frogging linen. That's one thing. You can frog it over and over and over again, and it's only going to get softer and easier to work with. So linen can be a bit stiff and twiggy, depending on exactly which yarn you're using. Sometimes you can get a linen yarn that's recycled linen, for example, and it's already been through it. It's been in the world. It's been through it. It's already softened. So those are nice to work with and behave a little bit differently than your sort of fresh, 100% pure linen. So if you want to soften your yarn before knitting, like if you find it is very uncomfortable, you can wind the yarn into a skein. So if it's already in a ball or a donut, put it into a skein if it isn't already, and then soak it in lukewarm water for 30 minutes, allow it to dry, and then you can wind the yarn into a ball. And now, because linen does have a tendency to stick to itself, a center pull ball is not recommended. So you have to say bye-bye to center pull balls when you're working with linen, or else you're going to have a really tangled mess coming out of the middle of your ball. So one tip I've seen time and time again is that you can wind it around an empty toilet paper roll. But if you're working with lino, like what we have in this KAL, it already comes wound into a nice loose ball, and it's just ready to roll and ready to knit with. I find that the lino is soft enough, pliable enough that you can just get going with it. Another thing I've heard people do is that you can just wind it into a ball multiple times. Wind it again, maybe 3 or 4 times. And that will be enough working with it to soften it up a bit as well. So the more that it's handled, the softer and more pliable it gets. And then if you do decide that you want to soak it first, you just really need to make sure to hang it to dry and let it dry completely before you start working with it again. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, and at the risk of being really annoying, I'm going to tell you that swatching with 100% pure linen is not optional. You absolutely have to do it. Your swatch will change quite a bit, and it's going to be a lot of heartache if you don't, because the way that your garment is going to turn out is going to be really surprising to you. So different linen yarns are going to behave in different ways, but because we're using lino for this KAL, I'm going to go off my experience swatching with BC Garn's 100% linen yarn lino, and I have put the link to that yarn in the description for you as well. So because linen lays and drapes entirely differently after it has been washed and dried, when you're knitting linen, your object may look a bit alarmingly wide and squat. So know that the aspect ratio of your swatch is going to change completely after it's been washed, from wide and squat to long and narrow. And that's just because the stitches are so stiff when you're knitting them. When they get wet, when they get washed, they loosen up and then they relax into place. So a swatch in linen will actually tighten up and lengthen after blocking. So it's important to wash your swatch the same way you wash the finished garment. And what I recommend doing is when you're starting your swatch a bunch of different needle sizes at the same time. So I swatched a 3.25 millimeter needle and a 4 millimeter needle, and the difference in gauge was quite substantial, like six stitches in less than a millimeter's difference on the needle. So when you're done, it's going to be narrower and longer. So your row gauge is going to get quite a bit longer, and your stitch gauge is going to get narrow. So you'll have more stitches per inch. So this is why a lot of linen patterns look like they have super weird gauges. So for example, a sport weight yarn at 20 stitches on a 3.5 millimeter needle. This is because of the inelastic nature of linen, which changes so much with washing and wearing. So if you swatch and wash, you shouldn't have any crazy surprises when you're finished your project. If you don't swatch and wash, I think you're going to have a rude awakening. And again, like I said before, just to save yourself some trouble, maybe do 2 or 3 different swatches at the same time. I actually put like a little eyelet at the bottom of my swatches to show what needle size I used most of the time. So for example, this is the swatch I ended up using, which was knit on 4 millimeters. So I put 4 little eyelets there just to show. So good luck to you. I hope that that was enough information to get you going and to get you thinking of linen differently than wool. Go forth and swatch. Swatch, watch, watch. You can ask me questions in the comments of this video. You can join us on our virtual knit along, which is on Facebook. So you can search Needles in the Hay Virtual Knit Along. It's a private group. Request to join and we'll add you. And that's where progress photos and chat from this KAL is happening. If you'd like to join in, there's a blog on our website that I'll put in the description as well. It gives you all the information, all of my pattern selections for this KAL, and participation is free. You're here, right? So you can visit needlesinthehay.ca to get your hands on some BC Garn linen, and I hope you'll all get swatching and we'll get moving with our projects. So in video 3, I'm going to be talking about finishing linen. So finishing your completed project so that it's soft and pliable and it has the right drape and hang. And that's going to be coming out on August 10th.